representing Canada's financial capital, the fourth largest city in North America, and the most amazing city in the world. This is Toronto Business Journal.
Welcome everybody to another fabulous edition of Toronto Business Journal. We have an amazing guest today, Professor Evans. He's going to be talking to us about the social gospel and also his amazing upcoming book. So take it away, Santosh.
Christopher Evans is professor of the History of Christianity at Boston University. He's the author of several works on North American religious history with particular focus on the social gospel movement. His books include The Social Gospel in American Religion, New York University Press 2017, Histories of American Christianity, Baylor University Press 2013, Liberalism Without Illusions, Baylor 2010, and The Kingdom is Always But Coming, A Life of Walter Rauschenbusch, Eerdmans 2004. His upcoming book, Do Everything, The Biography of Frances Willard, Oxford University Press, explores the life of the famous late 19th century American temperance and women's rights reformer who was also an early representative of the social gospel in the U.S. Welcome to the show, Christopher Evans. Very nice to have you here.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Welcome, Professor Evans. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the social gospel, one thing which I wanted to sort of introduce our viewers to is what sort of inspired us to want to explore social gospel in sort of today's events and the unfolding of news and so forth. And what sort of got me inspired to want to reach out to you, Professor Evans, is when I sort of speak to people who are sort of profess to be involved in politics, and I talk to them, people who profess to be, Christian and involved in politics, particularly, politicians, and who refer to themselves as social conservatives or fundamentalists. When I speak to them about, what about issues of poverty in the Bible? What are we going to do about, there's poverty, there's social inequality. I see people eating out of garbage cans, and there is all sorts of these stuff, injustices going on. And what always happens to the reaction I generally get is they kind of look at you almost as if you're asking someone in the military about aliens. Like they just want to change the subject. They kind of have that lost look, and they want to change. And when I speak to people who are sort of the supporters of these sort of movements and the rank and file grassroots supporters, they sort of regard me as, Marxism, I says, if you saw a dog in the street and you gave them food, would that be socialist? Would you be a Marxist? And they kind of laughed it off and, didn't want to get into that. So the interview today is an opportunity of exploring what the social gospel is about, how it sort of distinguishes between sort of social gospel and sort of fundamentalism. And basically my thoughts when I speak to people who are sort of, and I sort of try to get deeper with the people who are sort of consider themselves social conservatives, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Evans, what I see is a certain vision of society. The vision of society of social conservatism and fundamentalists seem to be that if someone is poor or something, whatever their lot in society, that is because God intended for them to be. That's basically what God's unfolding is what we see. And the role of politics is to impose order, is to make sure that people behave themselves. They don't, do stuff like, abortion and a variety of sort of rules and regulations. But if you compare that to the social gospel interpretation of Christianity, and I think when I was reading one of your articles, the social gospel goes beyond Christianity. But when we look at the social gospel, it has a completely different view that it's very grounded in this idea that oppression does exist in society, and through and inspired by the Bible and religion in general, we can move society in this sort of loving space of a caring society that's concerned about oppression, social inequality, injustices, and uplift society. So it's like a completely different prism. So I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on sort of this context of what the social gospel is and how it sort of distinguishes itself between social conservatives, because most people today, when they think about religion and politics, they're thinking of the version of society that is sort of close to what former President Trump had, this sort of, and don't think of the possibilities of religion beyond that sort of construct that this is what society is and just know your place. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what the social gospel is for people who don't know what it's about.
Well, you've really done an excellent job, I think, outlining the kind of social conservative view that I think is all too common in North America right now. The one thing I would add to your list too, in relationship to that vision, is the idea of being free to do what you want, usually reflected oftentimes in economic terms, to make a lot of money. This is certainly very endemic, I think, to American politics, and has really represented the way that I think a kind of conservative vision of Christianity has been merged with conservative political interest, particularly in the States, at least since the time of the New Deal, although I think you could probably say earlier than that. What I see as the social gospel, in its broadest sense, I would define it, and this comes out of a number of different historical sources. It's an effort to, in some way, recover the religion of Jesus, and particularly in the context of looking at Jesus as a historical figure. When you had mentioned earlier, well, look at the Bible and look at what certain passages seem to suggest about the relationship of faith and wealth and the responsibility of faithful people to care about the poor. Well, in a lot of respects, the proponents of the social gospel took those ideas very seriously. They were very focused on a recovery of the historical Jesus. And again, there were a lot of dimensions, particularly at the end of the 19th century, that were conducive to that recovery. So it was an idea of trying to find ways by which the ministry of Jesus could translate into the context of societies in the West that were industrialized, that were very urban-based, and also had noticeable wealth discrepancy between the rich and the poor. The US and Canada have very similar histories in some respects in terms of immigration. The end of the 19th century saw a number of immigrants coming, particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe, also parts of Asia. And the awareness, again, of those who were in the social gospel movement of urban poverty drove them to look carefully and try to make a synthesis between what they saw as the ethics of Jesus with a concern for systemic social reform. Now, a lot of Christian movements historically have cared about questions of poverty. And I think that's, again, a very broad discussion we could have, getting into a lot of different sources from the early church and really through thousands of years of religious history. But I think the social gospel difference here was a belief that part of the purpose of looking at salvation was not just simply to define it in individual terms of an individual becomes converted, receives Jesus, and lives a better life, but how conversion could be applied to the social order. Walter Rauschenbusch, probably the main figure of the social gospel movement in the United States, who also had a very, very strong influence on the social gospel in Canada, used the term social salvation. And part of the message that he wanted to get across was it's great to be converted and to feel like you've been touched in some way by the Spirit of God. but how does that translate into a kind of systemic awareness of social problems, such as economic justice, race, class, militarism, taking very, very seriously the way that you begin to critique the inequalities of a time. So, to sum up, I would say that the most important thing about the social gospelers is that they were really intentional about moving beyond charity. Yes, it was great to feed the hungry and to be involved in those kind of individual missions, but you had to go further than that. And in some way, as you said very well in your introduction, you had to move beyond simply a concern with a handout or charity. You had to get to the root of social problems. You had to figure out why in society there is poverty, and how might someone who is a Christian or a person of faith live out a life that is devoted in some way to unpacking these problems and beginning the kind of work that would be necessary to address those problems.
Definitely. And one of the important sort of quotations that I saw, Professor Evans, in one of your article about Walter Rauschenbusch, was in his book on Christianity and the social ethics. He said that, quote, religion's chief purpose was to create the highest quality of life for all its citizens. So that to me is a completely different, diametrically opposing social view than the social conservatism we see today, where it just seems to be about imposing order against the population and without that concern about their quality of living.
That's right. And I think what's very important too about that quote, if you were to Google the term social gospel now, you would probably find a number of very negative comments, very pejorative. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Ray, about the fusion or the tendency of some to dismiss the social gospel as a form of Marxism. But people like Rauschenbusch were very concerned about, again, the quality of individual life, the sense that individuals had to experience an environment that would make a lived faith possible. And part of that, again, is having a living wage, being in a position where you can enjoy the fruits of society. So you could live a healthy life, both as an individual, but also in an economic sense. Rauschenbusch was very clear about the fact that wealth in and of itself, it was not a bad thing. And this comes out again, I think, in a lot of the writings. But in a sense, the social gospel tapped into a wide range of Protestant understandings about wealth, and particularly, I think, to a degree, Roman Catholic understandings about the inherent worth of the individual. So in a sense, what's very interesting about the quote that you just read, Rauschenbusch was trying to project a vision of society that would represent the fullness of an individual life, the idea of approximate equality, the idea, again, though, that individuals would be their best selves while they lived in communities that would manifest themselves with compassion and care for their neighbor.
Yeah, one thing which strikes me about social gospel, and this is why I think that people which try to characterize it as Marxism are like way off, because Marxism fundamentally viewed religion to be the opium of the people, whereas social gospel is, in my view at least, is a form of spiritual humanism, which which rejects that idea and says that we as humans are at our core empathetic beings, and the Bible's message of the meek shall inherit the earth, that who God is really serving God is not serving the oppressors, it is serving the oppressed. That sort of message that sort of spirituality reach in ourselves as human beings, as people who appreciate the message of Jesus, and to inspire us in our spirituality to move toward the kingdom of God, of a sharing, loving society, free of oppression, that we care for each other as an expression of our spirituality and our identity as human beings. So I think for me, at least in my opinion, when I look at not just Marxism, but liberalism and all these sort of contemporary political ideologies, for me, social gospel is the most powerful, transforming concept of how we as individuals can move beyond a society of what we see ourselves into a society which basically fulfills the aspirations of most human beings. So it's sort of a very sort of idealism, optimistic view of humanity and where we can move towards.
It should always be God above government, like not like the government shouldn't become like God. I mean, I just wanted to interject. A lot of these communist nations or Marxism, they become like, for example, Stalin basically became God of Russia, like, so I just wanted to add that in. It should always be God above government.
And I think to just build on what the two of you are saying, the social gospel, many of its proponents they were certainly aware of and read people like Karl Marx. And Rauschenbusch died right at the moment when Lenin was coming to power, so he didn't have a lot to say about the manifestations of the Russian Revolution. But many of the social gospelers circle back to a point that I think you both expressed in different ways. That the trouble with Marxism and various forms of communism is it negates the individual. And it also has a very predetermined view of the state and of history, that there is an inevitability that history is going to go from one phase of development to the next until you finally get this kind of communist utopia that is just going to evolve through historical processes. It's going to happen. Whereas the social gospel, and I think, again, a good representative of this tradition from a later period of time is Martin Luther King Jr., who really picked up on this social gospel idea of time when he made the comment several times in his public career that time in and of itself does not guarantee social progress or social catastrophe. I mean, historical circumstances will do what they will. But he also emphasized the idea that part of a lived faith, and I think this was very important to his own social gospel vision, he believed very much in the idea that certain moments were ripe for historical change, that if people of faith could respond. He loved to use this German word Zeitgeist, spirit of the time. And he frequently talked about his own life as being kind of caught up in these kind of forces, divine forces, that were challenging him and other people to see God's vision of ultimate justice in some way play out. And again, King was frequently called a communist and accused of communist sympathies, but he was very clear that his sympathies were not there, but with this kind of religion of Jesus, the kind of Christianity that he imbibed in his own career, which owes a great deal to people like Walter Rauschenbusch.
One of the key comments going back to the influence of Dr. Martin Luther King, one of the key quotations I saw in your article was that when Dr. King had said, any religion which professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not concerned about social and economic conditions that scar the soul is spiritually moribund religion waiting for a day to be buried. So to me, that was a sort of a poignant quote, which goes again on the role of religion in motivating and inspire people to deal with the ills of society, not accept them as simply God's plan for society, as the religious conservatives seem to do.
That's right. And again, King was very much a part of this tradition that he emphasized over and over again in his public career. And you think of his letter from a Birmingham jail, where he used that as an opportunity to say that when you look at Christianity in the US, too often the church is the tail light rather than the headlight, that it should be focusing a moral compass, not just upon individual ethics, but upon the behavior of governments, of economic interest, of certainly, again, when you look at issues of race and class, which were at the center of a lot of King's, particularly in his later life, the way that he was tying together issues of race, class, economic justice, internationalism, militarism in a very holistic way, I think.
Yeah, well, with that in mind, one of the sort of the important or sort of interesting things which I find is how social gospel played out has been playing out in Canada versus the States. And what I mean by that is that in the United States, the social gospel has continued to be sort of what I would call a sort of a underdog movement. But in Canada, the social gospel actually had an opportunity of having actual influence when the Tommy Douglas government got elected in the 1940s. And so that the social gospel had an opportunity of manifesting their policies directly in government. One of the most important impacts in terms of our sense of Canadian identity up here in Canada is is universal health care as a manifestation of the social gospel idea about a caring society. Tommy Douglas did a lot of work in terms of labor legislation, rights concerning reforms to protecting children, protecting all those sort of aspects of society that the social gospel professed to be important idealisms to motivate people. And that was sort of manifested, as you would know, in the Canadian Commonwealth Federation,
absolutely,
which evolved in the NDP. But it seems to me, when we compare Canada and the United States, a lot of the sort of social gospel has been sort of mainstreamed and institutionalized in such a way that when we think of ourselves as Canadians, when we think of universal health care and all those aspirations of how we view ourselves to be, that to me is implicitly social gospel ideas that Tommy Douglas inspired us to have, but Canadians don't really contextualize. And the United Church, for example, which to me is a unique church in Canada, is sort of an expression of the social gospel. I mean, they support LGBTQ rights and all those sort of minority rights where you wouldn't find, I don't know too many churches in the United States, but I guess you could find pockets, but such an organized big church supporting LGBTQ rights. So, but it seems to me that if we look at the two way in which social gospel has evolved in Canada and the United States, the social gospel has sort of been sort of mainstreamed to such a way that has been co-opted. It's kind of like you compare old hip hop to new hip hop, and now it's commercialized. And now in the United States, they just keep it at bay and marginalize it and contain it. So that to me is sort of interesting how you can sort of squash a movement by mainstreaming it and commercializing, and why don't you just contain it? So I was wondering if you have any sort of thoughts on how the social gospel is. Yeah, what you're saying, Santosh?
Also, I just wanted to add, does it have to do anything with the population as well? Like, is the social gospel different in the States because, there's like, I think over 330 million people, whereas in Canada, it's a lesser population. So I'm just wondering, like, if that also adds to it, or is it something cultural as well?
Those are fantastic questions, and I always point out to my students in the States that in a lot of respects, I think the Canadian social gospel impulse went farther. When you look at the foundation of the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, ministers like J.S. Woodsworth, Stanley Knowles were very important to creating that there's really a direct correlation between the Canadian social gospel into what ultimately became the New Democratic Party. And you mentioned people like Tommy Douglas, among others, who I think played a very important role in Canada. As you said, legislation like national health insurance, which is still a very, very contentious goal here in the States. I think there are also important parallels to that. I do think that there is a very, very strong component in US churches that are still very rooted in the social gospel. Now, some of that is in the States, I think, is regional. You see, and you certainly have regional dynamics, very strong ones in Canada, between what's going on in Ontario versus, say, what's going on in British Columbia. But you have in the States, I think, again, a situation right now where many churches are split on LGBTQ plus equality measures. There have been schisms in the past on these issues, and it's at the center again of the U.S. culture wars. When you look back though in terms of the U.S. The connection between religion and politics in the U.S., there is a very similar arc to Canada in some respects. At the same time that you see people like J.S. Woodsworth moving into politics in Canada, you have a number of disaffected ministers who left their churches, oftentimes Presbyterians and Methodists and Baptists, again, very similar to what you see in Canada. And they became very involved in the 20s and 30s with democratic socialism. So in the US, the Socialist Party kind of had its heyday, I think, in the 1930s. Its standard bearer was a man named Norman Thomas, who was very similar to people like Woodsworth. He was a former Presbyterian minister, heavily influenced by people like Rauschenbusch, and pushing again all of these kind of social welfare measures that ultimately in some way became part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal by the 1940s. But you have seen these conversations in the US. When you mention the word socialism, I mean, that's analogous to communism here. It's used as a very effective foil against efforts in the States like national health insurance, as one example, which is being very, very contested still. The sense again, I think in the States right now is there are a lot of strong examples of progressive-based religious movements. Probably the most visible one, and I mentioned this in one of my pieces, is the work of a minister in North Carolina named William Barber, who is part of an organization called Repairers of the Breach, which is an effort to create a multi-religious kind of people's coalition to work on issues such as economic justice, anti-racism, and again, the issue which is going to be at the forefront of American politics for a long, long time is the issue of voting rights, particularly for people of color. So William Barber is a good example of a progressive social gospel-based Christian who I think shows the continued vitality of the social gospel impulse. But you're right, Ray, going back to one of your comments, it certainly doesn't have the same type of grassroots support that you see among various segments of conservative evangelicalism in the States.
Yeah, so one comment or question I have to get your insight on is I'm thinking of sort of American political people who would most closely, you could say to an American, this is somebody in the United States who embodies the ideals and closest to the social gospel. And one political figure that I would name is RFK Jr., which I would say is strongly motivated by faith, has a strong sense of social justice, and seems to be unapologetic to messages which conflict with organized power. So I was wondering what thoughts you might have on that.
I think Robert Kennedy is a very good example, and even more in a more contemporary context, Jimmy Carter certainly has, even though I think a lot of the roots of his faith come out of a kind of brand of Baptist evangelicalism. Carter was an individual that really embodied, I think, a lot of social gospel precepts in the way that he tried to enact various economic reforms during his presidency, and also drew the ire of many religious conservatives who abandoned him in favor of Ronald Reagan. Another, I think, very important figure to mention in American politics who passed away a couple of years ago, one of my heroes, John Lewis, Georgia congressman who was very involved in the civil rights movement and very much inspired by the precepts of the social gospel. His name is currently attached to the voting rights measure, which unfortunately remains stalled in Congress. But I do think there are a lot of examples that one could point to. But I think too, again, a similarity between the US and Canada. These social gospel roots in many respects, and I would gather this is the case with the New Democratic Party today and people on the left in Canada. I think that many people on the left in North America are oblivious to those religious foundations. And sometimes it's generated by just not going beneath the surface, but I do think it reflects the kind of visceral reaction that some people on the left have to the idea that religion could play any constructive role in movements of social change, because they look at certain iterations of conservative evangelicalism, and Canada, as well as the U.S., has its share of those voices as well, but they tend to come across again as a kind of dominant voice of what religion is, that stands for a kind of narrow political agenda, also tends to be very white, oftentimes very prosperous, and in many respects, again, the way that these voices are associated in the minds of many progressives, I think in the US and Canada, is being anti-inclusion, exclusion of LGBTQ plus folks, and so on.
So with that said, Professor Evans, because you sort of, in the article which you wrote, you sort of, with that, talked about sort of the challenges of the religious left and the religious right. Perhaps, is there another challenge of the religious left? Could it be that also that because the social gospel is very challenging of power and domination and oppression, that handicaps its message, because the people in the media who have the power don't really want to proselytize or put out a social message which is going to hold them account spiritually for all the bad things that they do. And when we look at the religious right, their sort of view is that, okay, you know what, if you're rich, God, smiled on you. If you're poor, well, God had a plan for you too. And that's how society is. So is it the messaging of the religious right more sort of complementary and attractive to power, wanting to spread that message and not wanting to talk about messages of oppression and human rights and social justice and all that stuff?
I think when you look at large components of the religious right, there are a couple of things going on. One is it plays to a message oftentimes of hyper individualism that is kind of rooted in maintaining a certain social economic status quo. Now, this is a message that appeals to many people in North America in some way. If they're making large profits, they want to keep making large profits. And in some way, I think there are a number of examples of churches that are not just rooted in religious fundamentalism, but another good example, and this is something that I think relates to a lot of the people that surround Donald Trump, is the so-called prosperity gospel. And I think you were hinting at that a little bit, but you have a number of leaders coming out of these churches that say, listen, God expects you to make money. It is your duty to make money and to make as much of it as you can. And without any sense, again, of accountability to one's neighbor. The social gospel message of collective responsibility, of wealth sharing, of taking a very close look, particularly if you're white, middle class in North America, that can be a very, very difficult sell, particularly when you look at a number of denominations in the US and Canada that are very, very white, rooted to a degree in a level of economic and political privilege. That's a hard message. And one of the things that I think the social gospel has struggled with is it plays well, I think, to people who are well educated, who are oftentimes working in the context of larger economic political systems and are able to see some of these inequalities firsthand. It's a message that has been very attractive to certain segments of, again, when you look at people in the States, there are strong pockets that respond very favorably to a message that says, in effect, you are under judgment. You are under judgment because you are not taking seriously what the Bible says you should be doing in terms of service to the poor, and challenging people with that message in some way. It can be very, very difficult for churches to follow that kind of message. I mean, some churches, it's not. The United Church of Canada, which you were talking about earlier, Ray, I think is an example of a denomination that is very committed in principle to a lot of social gospel ideals. And there are denominations, very liberal progressive denominations in the States that do that as well. But one of the realities that all of these liberal churches are facing now is they're declining in membership. They're really having to think creatively about how to sort of reconfigure their message and their audience. But that is, I think, one of the things about when you look at conservative fundamentalist or what we would call more traditionally evangelical congregations that are predominantly white, they do tend to tell people what they want to already hear. They're not pushing people out of their comfort zone. And that's a very, very strong part of their appeal. The other thing that I would mention, though, and this is, I think, a point to really help you understand what's going on in the US right now with churches that we would call fundamentalists that are strongly in favor of Donald Trump. Many of these churches, many of these fundamentalists see themselves as the true victims. They tend to take the perspective that theirs is the true version of Christianity that all of these liberal movements have co-opted. The social gospel is one target for them, but they frequently rail against what they see as the sins of secular humanism. And what has happened, I think, again, with the kind of philosophy of Trumpism in the States, is a kind of very toxic mix of political and religious populism with a kind of religious ideology that appeals to people who perceive themselves as true victims. It can be a very, for those who are kind of outside of this worldview, it can be very, very difficult to get a handle on it. But there is this kind of language of victimization, but also in some way, and this is a theme that I think you see among a lot of very, very conservative evangelical churches, this kind of hyper masculinity that kind of looks at people who are interested in progressive causes, and including those who are part of the social gospel, as somewhat effeminate, or they're not really true to the convictions of Jesus. And so what they do is they kind of turn Jesus into this kind of hyper masculine figure who can support their own kind of ideology about the way the world is. And it's this sense of, well, if we don't stand up, all of these liberals and progressives and social gospelers, they're just going to overrun the country. They're going to take over, and they're going to get rid of all of what they perceive to be this kind of myopic vision of America's past, that's sort of rooted not just in whiteness, but in this kind of myopic vision of this idealized portrait of white conservative America.
With that in mind, one of the thoughts which I had when you were sort of talking about the religious left and the religious right, is this comes from my own contact with them. When I speak to people on the religious right, one thing which I do give them a lot of credit is that people in the religious right who identify with social conservative views, they are highly motivated to be vocal, to challenge what they see should be right, and get out there and speak up. Now, when I speak to the religious left these days, in yesteryear, when you referred to like Dr. Martin Luther King, and if you look at old sort of footage of Tommy Douglas, when he sort of was campaigning for Medicare, and he was like up there, and it was, to me, it brought up the image, if you've ever seen the movie 10 Commandments, it was like Moses standing up, parting the sea, saying, we are going to go here, thus the authority here, and let's go. They were motivational. The religious left now, for lack of a better word, is gutless. You don't see anybody like Tommy Douglas in Canada. You don't see anybody like Martin Luther King challenging the authority and stuff.
They're very divided, I find. The religious left, they're very divided.
Well, the religious left now, to me, I think their approach now is they don't want to rock any boat.
Yes.
They like negotiate with power in the back. They're getting their funding from government for their little festivals. They've been sort of co-opted. So because of that, people aren't really inspired by them. People say, why should I go to church? They're not relevant in my life. They're not speaking for me. If the religious left was strong, and if you had like people like Martin Luther King talking about atrocities today, Tommy Douglas, I think that would motivate people to say that church as more relevant to their lives. So I just find, just my personal view, that the religious lefts have been sort of become co-opted into their sort of, doing things in the background, not rocking a boat. And the religious right is like, we had enough of this. We want people to respect the right to life, abortion. We want people to behave themselves. They're vocal. They're not there. So to me, it's like a different mindset. And to me, that's what sort of frustrates me about the religious left. So I just want to get your thoughts about that.
I would add to what you said too, Ray. I think another dimension that really hampers the religious left, well, it's partly a good thing, but it also clouds the message. The religious and secular left, I think in both the US and Canada, have really engaged a wide spectrum of issues that I think are very, very important, and certainly to a degree galvanize certain constituencies. So when you look at, for example, efforts at LGBT equality, the concern for causes like global warming, there you could find a plethora of issues that are being rolled out. But the trouble is sometimes it creates a very foggy platform. I don't want to go too off topic here, but again, when you look at it's sort of like the Democratic Party in the States, because you see the fact that so many constituencies in the Democratic Party are exercising different priorities, or coming out with sort of different themes about where they want to go. And it creates a very foggy message, whereas I think the advantage that sometimes the social conservatives have, they stay on script. You know, they have a very clear message that they want to get across to their base, and they do it very, very effectively. And I think I said this before, but the sense of what I just find really, it's fascinating, but it's also tragic. I mean, we're at a point, I think, in the United States where it's almost impossible now for left and right to find any common ground. And I think part of that is a genuine fear that comes from both. And from the right, it comes out of this sense that they represent this kind of true vision of what America should be, that is strongly male-centric. It's very much embracing kind of an uncritical view of capitalism, but it's an effective message. It kind of steers a lot of these conservative groups back to this idea that they're under siege. And this has been, again, I think in the States, a real difference between, I mean, you have fundamentalist groups in Canada, certainly, but I think in the US, there's this very, very strong sense of victimhood. I mean, we're the true Christians. We are the ones with the truth. And pointing to all of these examples of groups and politicians that are taking away their rights and privileges. I mean, this really goes back again to, I think, FDR's presidency in the 30s. But I like the way, Ray, when you talked about people like King and Douglas. I mean, I've seen films of Douglas speaking, and there is, again, that he had that ability to read the pulse of the people and the culture of the time, and really, again, in terms of his premiership, became an example, I think, for the rest of Canada of what could be done when you have this kind of issue that comes along at a time that really grabs a base of people, both in terms of the economic justice of it, but also, just from a moral standpoint, it's the right thing to do, that a society has an obligation to take care of everyone, and not just those who can afford to pay exorbitant money for decent health care.
Could you tell us about your upcoming book, Professor Evans? I'm sure viewers are anxious to hear about that. They'll want to buy a copy of your book after listening to our interview, so I'm watching it. So wanted to hear about your upcoming book.
Well, I'd love to talk about it, and maybe perhaps in the future I can come back for another session with you. But my book is on a woman named Frances Willard, who was a very, very famous leader in the United States, and as well very respected in Canada in the women's temperance movement. Now, where the United States went further than Canada was in the enactment of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which outlawed the sale and distribution of alcoholic beverages. Very contentious measure, and for a variety of reasons, it failed. But Willard was very much at the forefront of the women's suffrage movement in the United States. And she was very, very focused on organizing women in North America and internationally on a variety of issues pertaining to women's rights. So at the forefront for Willard was the idea of supporting women's suffrage. She was a fierce campaigner for suffrage legislation in Western nations. She was very concerned with economic justice. And again, part of the connection, one of the reasons why many social gospelers were tied to the prohibition or the temperance movement is they looked at the social consequences of alcohol and drug abuse. They recognized the way that these were connected to questions of poverty, how oftentimes manufacturers of alcohol preyed on poor people. So Willard was very much attuned to the way that alcohol abuse oftentimes led to a plethora of social problems, such as poverty and domestic violence against women. She also, I think, was part of a broader movement, which I think we still see today, not only in the regulation of drugs and narcotics, but what ultimately became 12-step movements, how individuals who found themselves in addiction could work with other people in terms of lifting themselves out of that state. So she moved away from seeing alcohol abuse as a moral failing to a social problem that required broader solutions. What I really think is important to this conversation, though, Willard branded herself as a Christian socialist. Now, the term Christian socialist was very prominent in Great Britain, Canada, the United States in the late 19th century. And in some ways, it did reflect and mirror an attraction to democratic socialism. But it was more broadly, again, focused on the idea of collective responsibility. What I find very interesting about a person like Frances Willard, and this is true of many of the social gospel figures we've been talking about, they raised a difficult question because they say to us, we're a free people, but there's also a responsibility to your neighbor. You have to be willing to kind of give a little something up in order to facilitate and care for the health and welfare of your neighbor. And I think, again, Willard was a fantastic optimist, and she didn't live to see many of the goals that she aspired to. She was very disappointed. She hoped she would live long enough to see the United States elect a woman president. That has still not happened in the United States. But I think the question that she leaves us with, and this is something I think, again, as I was hinting at just a moment ago, you see across the spectrum of social gospel thinkers, to what extent do you need to give something up, to give something of yourself, whether it's money, resources, time, etc., for the betterment of the whole. And when I look at what's going on, I'm sure you have these situation in Canada as well, but the lack of civility that characterizes many people who are anti-masking, anti-vaxxing, I think it's a very sad commentary in some way, again, about the ability of a supposedly civilized society to care for the least of these. There's not, the conversation might go in a different direction in Canada, but in the States, it's very much, you're taking away my rights, you're taking away my freedoms. Well, at what point is that a good thing? At what point should you not own a gun? At what point should you be required to wear a mask or have a vaccine? These 19th century, early 20th century figures challenged us in some way to think about these kind of issues. And in a lot of respects, there are signs of progress, certainly, and we've talked about them in this conversation, but it also, I think, points to the long distance we have to go to get to a point, as Martin Luther King said, to be a society that in some way is at peace with itself.
Yeah, so definitely well said, Professor Evans. I think that, in terms of the social gospel message, is that one of the important ideas of it, as well as not just simply to giving is important as an important part of our sense of humanity, but it's also important for us to embrace diversity, different points of view. We're all sort of, and this is what again is being lost in civility, because you have different factions all wanting to impose their own sense of what we should be on everybody else. And this is destroying that's the idea of people coexisting and coming together in our diversity of opinion. So I think that sort of civility is being lost in terms of different competing groups wanting to dominate each other, irrespective of what their views are, and censor, and this is we're right and we're not about you to talk.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. No, just like they're competing like they're brands or like, companies, instead of like, learning from each other and uniting for a better growth. That's very important.
Yes. Yeah. No, you're both absolutely right. And the question again of religious diversity, cultural diversity is a critical issue in both the United States and Canada. I mean, we share very similar histories. I think particularly when you look at the perspectives of certainly the major cities, places like Toronto and Vancouver, Winnipeg, which really, I think, parallel the kind of histories that you would have in US cities like Boston, Chicago, Seattle, and so on. But the resistance to that, the feeling that in some way this diversity is a threat, not just, I think, economically, but what you see in America, in the US, I should say, which is so disturbing, and this gets to your point, Ray, it's almost an existential outburst or a sense of a kind of trauma that is seized upon many people who are just resistant to things like multiculturalism, the kind of inclusivity that I think characterizes the way that both in the history of Canada, in the US, you see a lot of examples of moving towards a kind of broader issues of diversity, which challenges us to think about the way we work together, we play together. Certainly, I'm sure you've had this conversation with various businesses and corporations that have had to deal with major shifts in the workforce as demographics of the US and Canada have shifted. But there is a sense again that, and I go back to Martin Luther King, where he made the statement towards the end of his life, we're in a position to really, in some ways, attack some of the great social problems that we face at this time. But the real question is, do we have the will? And those words from King, I think, still haunt all of us in some way in terms of where we are now politically, culturally, and in some respects existentially, I think, as people.
I think one of the sort of disturbing trends which I see in Canada and in the United States, but also in Canada, is this sort of narrative that the right is now supposedly for individual rights, and then the left is purely for, in the sort of pandemic, a sort of collectivist sort of construct. And so I think I'm seeing this sort of this sort of disparity going on. And I think one of the points with Tommy Douglas that people forget in terms of the social gospel is that in 1947, his was the first government in Canada to enact a Bill of Rights, which became later adopted in Canada as the Canadian Bill of Rights. He sort of copied a lot of stuff federally that Tommy Douglas, sort of innovations by Tommy Douglas when he was premier in Saskatchewan. So in reading Tommy Douglas and the social gospel, one of the important points is they make, seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Evans, is that, they're concerned about freedom and rights, and this is what we're talking about today, freedom of rights, but they seem to have said that before we can have freedom and rights truly for the population, we need to first deal with oppression. You cannot have people truly free if they are, don't have a place to live, don't have shelter, don't have clothing, like the First Nations,
That's right.
no
Very
clean
true,
running
yes.
water.
Yeah.
Once
Basic
we get
needs
rid
have
of
to be met.
oppression, yeah, we were saying that, Tosh?
Oh no, basic needs have to be met first. Like
basic needs met.
Yes.
So that, and then after you make basic needs, then we can have a conversation about freedom of rights. But what's going on now is that, for example, when I was at a freedom march, people are chanting freedom, 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 but they're not connecting necessarily. When I speak to a lot of these people who are sort of organizing these moves, they're not. What about oppression? What about people who can't come to your march because they're too busy worrying about food? They don't have, they can't do this. They don't have a roof over their head. They're worried about their job. They just got fired because they don't have vaccine passport or whatever, vaccine mandates. There definitely is a concern about vaccine mandates and passports within these movements, but there's the social gospel. That's why, in my view, it goes beyond simply sort of this sort of collectivist construct of socialism to saying that we need, because a lot of the people who are in the socialist movement who are outside of social gospel, they talk about collectivity, but they don't talk like what's happening with Macron and stuff like that in France, just oppressing rights, don't care about people's rights as individuals, whereas the social gospel was definitely not Marxist, not only because Marxism supported the idea that religion is the opium of the people, but they were concerned about individual rights, but recognized that we need to first deal with oppression at all levels of society, and then we can have a society where people are truly free. Tommy Douglas used to talk about we need to feed people's belly first before we can talk about their soul. So I just want to get your sort of thoughts on that in terms of individual rights and the social gospel.
Yes.
And just want to get your thoughts on that, Professor.
Well, and what you've highlighted, Ray, to me, again, goes back to the question of how so often the critique that I have of people who are, my rights are being taken away and you are depriving me of my innate right to do what I want to do. It misses the idea of the consequences of a person's behavior upon the health and welfare of their neighbor. Now, in a lot of respects, again, and this is when you were talking about Tommy Douglas, and I think this is something that he shared with a number of what you would probably call great leaders. Yes, he had a social vision, but he also spoke very much to the needs of the individual. There's a sense, again, where I think when you talk about someone who is a prophet, yes, they challenge people to think about sort of social injustices, social evils, but they also get the individual to see in a loving way that they too are under judgment, that they too have a responsibility to reach out and help one's neighbor. And from what I know about people like Tommy Douglas, he had that ability to reach in and speak not just to a collective, but to affirm the worth of individualism. That again, when you support the needs of your brother or sister, you are supporting your own self. You are supporting your own needs. And this goes back again, really, to where our conversation this afternoon started, when we were talking about the need of the social gospel at its best was very holistic, because yes, it was focused on the collective, but it was also focused on the belief that not only did the individual matter, but the individual could change to do something more and something greater than what they first believed they could.
So, Professor Santosh, do you have a question for Professor Evans?
Yeah, like I think we've covered everything, but so how can our viewers right now, they're inspired by all this, and I do know there's a quote that you used in your book, what would Jesus do? So how can they use that in their own lives? Say they see somebody that's kind of down and out, how can they help them in the short term? And then of course, enable it so that they are also helped in the long term, so they can take care of themselves and maybe share that, the help they got with more. Any ways that you suggest, Professor?
I think part of it, Santosh, again, that's a very, it's a good question. It's a very complex question, and we could again probably just spend hours talking through that. The what would Jesus do quote is not mine. It really represents, again, sort of a strand of social gospel thinking from the late 19th century, but it's a persistent question, I think. To be honest with you, I would start, I think a way of starting out is to be informed. We live at a time, and you too have experienced this and know this well, that the difficulty of many people to really take the time to read, to explore issues, to listen to podcasts, to just become updated on what is possible, what is going on in the world, and then the question of how you can make a difference. I think part of the way of changing society, and this is again maybe a little bit of a cliche, but it's very true, is to become involved, whether it's through a religious organization, whether it's through some type of an organization. Find a cause that's near and dear to you and work for it. I do think, and this sort of circles back to an earlier question about what sometimes plagues the left. I think too often a lot of progressives, and I sometimes indict myself for this. I mean, I have I have an academic job, and I've taught at a major research university for a number of years. I love my work, but I am always reminded when I take the train into Boston of the kind of social problems that you encounter on a daily basis. And one of the things that Frances Willard said to her followers many times is you can't make change by proxy, or you can't do ministry or transformative justice work by proxy. In some way, you got to get in and get your hands dirty. And I don't think there's one road for everybody. I mean, some people are called to different types of work. Some are meant to be activists, some are meant to be teachers, some are meant to be lawyers and doctors, some are journalists, some are from the business community, so others are politicians. takes people working in concerted ways that I think makes a difference. And if I could sort of get into very specific religious faith-based language here, I think for a lot of people it comes as a call that they find themselves at a moment of life when they realize that they are meant to do, to live, to work, and to think in a certain way. And everybody has different gifts, different passions. And I think when you can begin to energize people, particularly on a community-wide level, you have the basis of a movement.
Yeah, I just want to urge our viewers who want to know more about the social gospel to check out your book, The Social Gospel in American Religion, A History. Is available on Amazon, and check it out at a bookstore near you. Is there any sort of thoughts you wanted to leave us today that you might not have been able to mention, either at this interview or previous interviews, about your perspective on the social gospel, or where we can, any sort of views or thoughts you have, Professor Eerdmans?
I would just conclude, and I've really enjoyed the conversation with both of you this afternoon. This has been a delight. I think, again, it's important to study religion from the perspective of how it translates into the fiber of society. And again, for all of the differences between the US and Canada, religion historically has played an important role. And I think, as we've talked about, understanding the history and the broader arc of the social gospel is a way to understand the kind of dynamic character of religion and the importance, again, of how faith, even from the standpoint of our time, is never private. There's sometimes a sense of, well, when we pray or worship or engage in whatever kind of religious activity, that's somehow private. There are aspects perhaps that venture into that in terms of an individual's devotional life or their spiritual life. But faith, I think, also is about putting your boots on the ground. And you see that in a number of the individuals that we've been fortunate to talk about today.
Thank you very much, Professor Evans, for that. Definitely, I share your thoughts, Professor Evans. We definitely need to start putting our boots in the ground. We need to start bringing our faith to a level where we can make a difference in society, and to have a brighter future in the process. So thank you, Professor Evans, for your words.
Thank you very much, Professor.
My pleasure. I've loved the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Evans, for joining us for another edition of Toronto Business Journal. All right. So you got that, Santosh?
Yeah, I'm going to stop recording right now. Okay.
Oh.